Hello and welcome to Lesson 26 in our survey of Genesis. This will be the last lesson of this series, and it's been a real pleasure for me to participate in this series, and I know that the other shepherds feel exactly the same way. We have been spending most of the last several lessons talking about Joseph. We've been spending time with Jacob and switched over to really follow Joseph's life. The lesson that Richard taught last week was that reunion of the two families of Jacob and Joseph, and obviously before that, the brothers with Joseph and all of the drama associated with that. And I really enjoyed watching that lesson. I know Richard had a great time delivering that lesson. This is going to be from the last three chapters of Genesis, 48, 49, and 50, and really serve to wrap up the story of Genesis and then launch us into Exodus, where Genesis becomes the sort of backdrop for the audience for Genesis and Exodus. As Moses is writing those books, he's telling a story to the people to remind them of who they are and where they come from. And so this is really wrapping that up. We're going to, as we have been in my lessons, kind of following the life journey of Jacob and where he is in his life. And we've been moving down through these various stages, and here we are at the bottom of his life journey. Jacob is going to pass away at the age of 147, having, as we'll see in these last three chapters, received some type of reconciliation, some closure, which is a really good thing to see in Jacob's life with all of the drama in his life. And even to the extent that some of the family drama that we've been talking about is reconciled as well. And so in many respects, this is a very good and comforting lesson. But it is a lesson on death, which is not a subject that we like to talk about. We like to avoid conversations about death, even though it is one of the most common denominators among the human race. There are two events that we almost all have in common. That's a birth and a death. And except for Adam and Eve, who weren't born but created, and except for Enoch and Elijah, who were taken up and didn't have a natural death, everyone else, as far as I know, either has or will experience a birth and a death. So it's our common human experience. And yet, it's something that we don't often talk about. In fact, until modern times, death was an experience that was largely a shared experience. It was something that was natural, and it was something that was common, and it was most often something that was shared by a family. That when someone, especially someone who died of old age, rather than some accident or some unexpected event, when that time came, you would often see family and close friends gathered around. If the person who was on their deathbed was able to interact with them, they may share fond memories, or there may have been kind words that were exchanged, maybe even a form of blessing that was provided by the person who was passing away. But in our modern age, we've tended to relegate this process of dying to professionals and to professional environments. And in some cases, we have people who are dear to us that are leaving this life and moving to the next all by themselves, alone, or with just professionals. Until modern times, you typically would see somebody's death witnessed by a lot of different people, that they would have stories to tell. And the end chapter of somebody's life would have its own story. And there's probably some lessons for us here about the way that we manage this last chapter of our life. And I'm actually glad to see that more and more people are able to die in their homes with hospice or other forms of support, where undoubtedly it's more comfortable for the individual, but it also gives the family a sense of closure as they're able to potentially be around the individual. So this is the type of experience that we're going to see, the more typical experience until modern times, when you would have family gathering around someone who is passing away. In this case, the patriarch of this entire large family is going to be leaving this life. And so even though that's the case, we're going to see yet another example of where Jacob may not have been the perfect example of how to pass on and have an experience for your family that's optimal, in that he's going to have left a lot of things unsaid until the very end, I'm assuming. That probably would have been better to have been said or shared while he was alive. And that's another lesson for us as well, that it's often better, always better, I think, to say the things that need to be said as you're living life, or even more important, sharing the things that need to be shared while living life, rather than waiting for the very end to say things that need to be said when, frankly, you may not have the opportunity to do that at all. And how often have we been to funerals where things were said about the individual that they probably would have liked to have known before they were dead? All these things that people come up and say about the person and what an impact they made on their life and how great the experience was living with them. Or frankly, even if there were some regrets that were expressed, how much better would it have been if those would have all been expressed prior to the person passing away? And by the same token, things that somebody might have aspired to do while they were living, a trip that they wanted to make, or a time that they wanted to spend, and they're always putting it off until some future time, and then time runs out. Well, to an extent, that's the case with Jacob, that there are some things that probably should have been said, and many things that probably should have been shared that just didn't get done. And we've been beating up on Jacob a lot as we talked about him, and in many cases for good reason. But I'm going to give him some credit here for, at least at the very end, doing the right thing and trying to create closure in a couple of different ways that we're going to see. And so we're going to start out in chapter 48, when a messenger is sent to let Joseph know, because remember, Jacob and all of his family are living in the land of Goshen, and Joseph still has his responsibilities as prime minister, not his title, but prime minister of Egypt, and number 2 guy. And so he's going to be living off in the capital, most likely next to the palace building, next to Pharaoh himself. So somebody's going to have to go send him a message that says that his father is very ill. I'm assuming that during this 17-year period from the time that Jacob was reunited with Joseph, that there's been plenty of times when they've spent time together. That's just an assumption on my part, but I'm assuming that with his family in Goshen, Joseph wouldn't just be hanging out in the capital, never visiting his family, but that is where he most likely is. And so Joseph is told that his father is ill, probably very ill. And so Joseph takes his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and takes them back to Goshen to visit his father. And it was told to Jacob that Joseph has come to him. And then you see this statement. It says, then Israel, or Jacob, summoned his strength and sat up in his bed. And so you just have this visual of someone who is very weak and feeble, and Jacob has lost his eyesight like his father Isaac, is very dim, so he's almost blind. And with Joseph showing up, it gives him the energy to actually summon the strength to sit up in his bed to have an interaction with Joseph. And this is how that interaction is going to go. Jacob probably surprises Joseph with his response to Joseph's visit. I don't know what Joseph's expectations were, but it seems like he's mainly there to visit his father and to see his dad for the last time. And I don't know that he has an expectation that there's going to be some formal thing that happens, but this is what happens. Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and I will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. So he starts out his visit with Joseph by testifying to his encounter with God at Luz, and reminding Joseph of what no doubt Joseph, the story he'd heard over and over as a child, that Jacob had received a great blessing there in that encounter with God, that God had made him specific promises that he would have a big family, and that that family would prosper, and that ultimately the gift of this land that he was living in, this promised land, would be for him and his family. And so he reminds Joseph of that encounter and that blessing. And then I'm pretty sure that the next thing that happens is a complete shock to Joseph. Because what Jacob is going to do is he's effectively going to adopt Joseph's two sons. He's going to adopt them as his own, and he's going to elevate them in status to be the same as all the brothers. He's going to elevate them in status to be the same as Joseph. And he names out Reuben and Simeon in the process. I'm not going to read all the scriptures that we have before us, but I'm going to read this one because I think it would have been striking to Joseph. And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. He names out specifically Reuben and Simeon, his firstborn and his secondborn, and says that Ephraim and Manasseh, and notice the order he lists them. Manasseh is the oldest, and Ephraim is the secondborn. Jacob says, Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine. And he says that the other children that Joseph has or has had are going to be Joseph's. In other words, Ephraim and Manasseh are as Jacob's children. Joseph's other children are as his grandchildren. And that they're going to be called after their tribe's names. So any other children Joseph had are going to be in the tribe of Manasseh or Ephraim, and I have no idea how that would be sorted out, which is which, because Joseph only has one wife, so it's not going to be like the children from one wife go to one tribe and to the other. And Joseph is one of the few agents with only one wife. So in this case, I'm not sure exactly how they sort that out, but that's the way it's going to work. And then lastly, Jacob remembers Rachel, which is important to remember. Rachel's Joseph's mom. And it's a sweet moment where Jacob is remembering Joseph's mom and saying, maybe with regret or sorrow, that Rachel wasn't able to continue on his life journey, at least to the point where he was able to bury Rachel in the family burial ground at Machpelah, where Abraham, Isaac, ultimately Rebekah, Leah had all been buried. But Rachel's buried somewhere else. And so that would be a point of sadness, but he ends this part of the interaction with Joseph with a memory of his mom. And so that's a sweet moment. At this point, it seems as if Manasseh and Ephraim come closer, and Jacob or Israel sees the sons, and he says, who are these? These men who are in front of me. Remember, it's been 17 years since Jacob and Joseph were reunited, and Manasseh and Ephraim were born before that point. So they're at least 18 years old and more, which is a grown adult man, especially at this time. So often when you look at pictures of this event, you'll see Joseph and his two sons, and his two sons are portrayed as little kids. They're not. They're grown men. So grown men are going to show up, and Israel's going to say, who are these? I doubt it's the first time Jacob has met his grandchildren, Manasseh and Ephraim. But because of his poor eyesight, and possibly because of even how they've grown since he last saw them, he's saying, who are these men that are here? And something special is about to happen, right? And so Joseph brings them in close, probably has them kneel on the ground at Jacob's feet, so at his knees, so they can be close and be at his eyesight, since he's kneeling on the edge of his bed. And the first thing that happens in this passage is that Jacob expresses his deep gratitude for the fact that he's even able to see Joseph, and not only Joseph, but his two grandsons, when he never expected to see them. He never expected to see Joseph again after he got the report that Joseph had been apparently killed. And he's just taking this moment at the end of his life to express gratitude to God, I think, for the fact that he's able to see Joseph. It says, Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also. And then Joseph removes them from his knees. And I think what it means is that he had them stand up or back off a little bit, not be at the center of attention, because Joseph is going to move into the center of attention. And in so doing, he bows down before his father Jacob, and it says his face is to the earth. So imagine the scene, right? You're Jacob sitting here. You have Joseph kneeling in front of you. You've got the oldest son Manasseh on Joseph's right hand, which would be Jacob's left. And you have Ephraim, Joseph's second-born son, on his left, or Jacob's right. So this is the scene. And if Jacob is kneeling on his bed, the two adult men are either standing before him, or most likely still kneeling, but the three of them are right in front of him. So that would be the scene. Okay? And here's what happens. It says that Israel stretched out as Joseph is bowed down, Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And think about it, Joseph is bowing before Jacob, so Jacob probably cannot see what Israel is doing at this moment. This is going to be the posture, right? And here's what Jacob says. The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. He pronounces this amazing blessing on these two sons of Joseph. And who knows if Ephraim and Manasseh even understand what's really going on here. Remember, they weren't raised in a Hebrew culture. They were raised in an Egyptian culture. And so this blessing that Jacob is delivering, it may have been something that was brand new to them and unexpected, and they weren't necessarily understanding even what was going on. It's also interesting to see that this blessing that Jacob pronounces is a combination of blessing and worship. That he's giving God credit. He's giving God credit for delivering on his promise, and there's gratitude that's enmeshed in this. And it's actually very comforting to see Jacob using this kind of language, that at the end of his life, it seems that he is comfortable and in sync with his relationship with God. And that striving that we see in his life, and that in fact is at the root of his name, Israel, is no longer there. And there's just a peace that's there in his relationship with God. But it's also interesting, and I skipped this part in verse 15 at the very start, that it says he blessed Joseph as he said. And that what he said was about these two boys. And to what extent is Joseph being blessed here? Because the words that Jacob delivers are for Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, the reality is what Jacob has just done in elevating Ephraim and Manasseh to the status of sons, in addition to what he says in the blessing, is to give Joseph a double portion of the inheritance. So what he has really done is bless Joseph with what would normally be the firstborn's inheritance, a double portion. Because now Joseph, through his two sons, is receiving a double portion of inheritance. And so that's the blessing to Joseph. When Joseph realizes what's happened, when he looks up and sees this crossed hands and the fact that effectively Ephraim is on Jacob's right hand and Manasseh is on the left hand, it says that Jacob's upset about that. And he probably assumed that his father, his eyesight had him mixed up, or who knows what he assumes. But he tries to sort of undo the situation. He tries to take Jacob's hands and put them in the right place, which is interesting because this would definitely be an awkward way to put a blessing. The most natural thing would have been for Jacob just to put his hands on the two sons as they were. But Jacob says, no, this is what I intended to do. He affirms that his prophetic vision that he has about these two sons is that Ephraim's going to be the greater and Manasseh's going to be the lesser. And he may not be speaking about the two individuals, but he's looking forward to the future and thinking about what their families, their tribes ultimately are going to do. And that's what we're going to see in the next chapter is as Jacob is talking to each of his sons, he's going to be looking to the future about what impact their tribe is going to have within the nation of Israel. And this is true. We're not going to talk about Ephraim and Manasseh in the next chapter because they're receiving their blessing right now. The other sons are going to receive a blessing in chapter 49. But the reality is that Manasseh will be a great tribe, but Ephraim is the greater tribe. In fact, Ephraim is really the leading tribe up until around the time of David. In fact, notable heroes from Ephraim are going to be Joshua, who leads the people of Israel into the promised land, and Samson will be an Ephraimite as well. So after the Davidic kingdom splits, the entire northern kingdom, so you have Judah and Benjamin and Levi down here in the south, really the entire northern kingdom is essentially Ephraim. The rest of the tribes have kind of either disappeared or kind of come into the tribe of Ephraim. In fact, the prophets often refer to the northern kingdom as Ephraim, just Ephraim. So what Jacob here is really saying is, I'm going to prophesy about the future. One notable thing about Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh, is that they're the only tribe that actually settled on both sides of the Jordan when they went to conquer the promised land. Part of Manasseh settled on the west side of the Jordan, part settled on the east, and so they were kind of split by the Jordan River. Just an interesting fact. But Jacob is just reaffirming this. And so he reaffirms it. Not only does he not move his hands, but he pronounces a second blessing on the two individuals. He says, by you, Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. In other words, he's formalizing the order. He's saying Manasseh comes, or Ephraim comes before Manasseh. How would this be a blessing? He didn't give them anything else. He didn't make any other promises. He simply reaffirms the order of it. And to some respects, it's a blessing just to know we are a place in the world, for them to understand what their future is. And for Ephraim and Manasseh to know that they've got a place in the family and a place in this future. And then in the very last part of this passage, it's interesting, Jacob gives Joseph some property. He says, I'm going to give to you, unlike the brothers, right? The rest of the brothers and their tribes are going to sort out the land when it's conquered. And where they settle is going to be up to Joshua and the process that they go through. But here, Jacob actually bequeaths to Joseph a specific piece of land. It's going to be this mountain slope that says that Jacob took from the Amorites, most likely referring back to chapter 34 of Genesis, and this is most likely a mountain slope right there in the area of Shechem, where Jacob was having conflict with the Canaanites that were in that area. That would be reaffirmed by the fact that in Joshua chapter 24, verse 32, it says that Joseph's bones were buried near Shechem. And so the assumption is that Joseph eventually makes his way back, at least his embalmed body makes its way back to this piece of land that was bequeathed, and he's buried there. So that's sort of the end of the interaction in 48 with Joseph. And the next thing that happens is that the rest of the sons are going to gather around. So presumably, Jacob is able to call them together very quickly. In fact, most likely, they were already gathered around, that they were on a death watch. They understood that their father was near death, which is why the messenger got sent to Joseph in the first place, right? So they were probably already gathered and near. It's possible that they even witnessed what had just happened between Jacob and Joseph and his sons. And so nobody needed to explain to them what happened. It's also possible that they did it, and some explanation would have to happen. Either way, the rest of the sons are going to gather around. Jacob says, "Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel, your father knows his own use of both of his names." So, we're going to very quickly traverse the blessings that Jacob gives to the rest of his sons. And the interesting thing here is that Jacob is going to go in birth order, starting with Reuben and going all the way to Benjamin, with one exception. And the one exception is that he puts Zebulun before Issachar for some reason. Don't know why. And the other interesting thing about the blessing is over half the content is focused on Judah and Joseph. So you're going to have Judah getting a huge chunk of the blessing and Joseph getting a huge chunk of the content of these blessings. And the other brothers receive much less, and in fact, in total, less than half of the sort of content of what Jacob's going to have to say. And here, remember, Jacob's 147 years old and almost blind and very weak. He does a remarkable job as he talks to each of his sons and brings out their character traits and talks about the kind of men that they were. And in addition to that, he talks about their tendencies and how that's going to flow through their family and ultimately what their tribes are going to be like. Not just their characteristics, but the tribes of their family, their tribes. And so there's prophecy involved in here. In fact, to be honest, most of this blessing is really prophetic. It's talking about the future and what's going to happen through the descendants of these various sons. And I kind of wonder at this point if they're not holding their breath. They're like, I don't know what's going to happen. To the extent that they know about or saw what just happened with Jacob and his sons, they may be wondering if they're going to receive a blessing at all or if they're just going to be disinherited in favor of Jacob and his family. I mean, that would make perfect sense, right? Jacob's royalty, he's off to a great start. He's in a great position to take care of Jacob's descendants, and he's in a perfect position to sort of execute the plan of having a great and large family. So they may just be holding their breath, wondering what's going to happen. Am I even going to be part of this family after it's all done? Who knows? So very quickly, Jacob praises Reuben, and perhaps we remember Reuben's sort of positive actions trying to save Joseph from death when Joseph was put in the pit. Remember, Reuben says, no, let's not kill him. Let's find another solution. Of course, they found the solution while Reuben was gone, but at least Reuben tried to sort of do the right thing. Maybe even remember in Richard's lesson that Reuben offered up, look, if we can't bring Benjamin back, then you can have my two sons and kill them, which is, an interesting offer. Nevertheless, there are some positive things said about Reuben here. And it sort of makes you wonder if Reuben's offense was ever brought up by Jacob before this point. In other words, did he ever raise this issue with Reuben before now? Or is just now Reuben hearing that his father knew all of this And now it has an impact on him and him receiving the blessing of the firstborn. I don't really know. But if this is the first that this interaction has happened, then what a miss. What a missed opportunity for Jacob to have actually brought this up to Reuben and had some sort of confession, repentance, amends, reconciliation. But that's not what happens. So Jacob says, you did a messed up thing, and because of that, it says you're reckless, it says you're unstable as water, and therefore you're not worthy of receiving the firstborn right. Well, I'm sure after Reuben, everyone's holding their breath at this point, like, uh-oh. If he's calling out Reuben and they're thinking about all the things that they've done, including what they did to Joseph, they may be thinking, great, I'm going to be up pretty soon, and what am I going to get? The next blessing is to the brothers, Simeon and Levi, and it's kind of more of the same, which probably even heightens the drama. And this especially is really prophetic, where Jacob talks about Simeon and Levi as being violent men, probably referring back to the fact that they slaughtered an entire town because of the defiling of Dinah. He says that they're, violent and they're reckless, and that there needs to be some repercussions from that, right? And so apparently the tribes of Simeon and Levi are going to carry this nature in their DNA. They're going to be tribes that have a violent nature. And so, in fact, we see that the Levites are still capable of killing lots of people, which they demonstrate after Moses comes down from the mountain and sees them worshiping a golden calf and basically separates the people who are going to be loyal to God and those who worship the calf. And the Levites go through and slaughter lots of people in the process, right? So this nature seems to be able to come out whenever. So Jacob says, look, you're going to be scattered in the promised land. The Levites will end up living in sanctuary cities spread out throughout the nation of Israel. They don't have a piece of property that's their own. They're spread out in these sanctuary cities, and their purpose is to serve in the synagogues and especially in the temple. And so they're spread out literally throughout the nation. And then Simeon doesn't receive a property either. They're hosted by Judah, in the land of Judah, and ultimately they're assimilated by Judah and really don't even become a separate tribe at all, other than just maybe families understanding their lineage. And so what Jacob says about these two comes to pass. The Levites by design and the Simeonites, not sure exactly how that unfolded, but they just ended up being kind of part of Judah. And so what Jacob said would happen, happens. So notable Levites, well, there's a ton of them, obviously. Moses, Aaron, and all the true priests that follow after him, Miriam, Moses and Aaron's sister, John the Baptist, and Barnabas were all Levites. And so obviously a great tradition and a huge role within the nation, but still no territory, right? They're going to drift within the nation. And then finally, Jacob has some uplifting things to say. I'm sure everybody is really relieved to finally hear some good news after Reuben, Simeon, and Levi received some pretty negative things. And perhaps this is somewhat reflective of Judah's transformation, at least as a parent transformation from chapter 38, with all of that mess that we talked about with Judah and Tamar. To the man who is willing to be Joseph's slave in order to let Benjamin go back to see his father, if you remember from Richard's lessons last week. And so maybe Judah has transformed. Maybe he's a different man. Maybe he's learned his lessons and mellowed like John did, the son of thunder, who ultimately becomes the apostle of love. More likely, it's a prophecy of God's plan for the tribe of Judah, which we know is to establish the royal line of David and ultimately the royal line of King Jesus, and Jesus' royal line, us. More likely, it's a prophecy about Judah. One interesting thing, there's lots of language here about how royal the tribe is, calling him a lion's cub, that he crouched as a lion, As a lioness, who dares rouse him? It says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Obviously, the scepter not departing from Judah ultimately finds fulfillment in Jesus Christ, who is king forever and ever. This, until tribute comes to him, can be translated as until Shiloh comes, which could be an allusion to the departure of the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh, which happens in the time of Samuel, and moves to the tribe of Judah around the time of David, which sort of signaled the replacement of Ephraim as the lead tribe, Shiloh being in Ephraim, and Judah taking on the preeminence within these tribes. Notable members of the tribe of Judah: Caleb. So you have Joshua, an Ephraimite, and you have Caleb, a member of the tribe of Judah, who are the two spies that come back with a good report and ultimately lead the children of Israel into the promised land. David, Solomon, Mary, Jesus, among many others. So Judah gets a positive blessing. Issachar and Dan should be happy with their inheritance. There are positive things that are said. Neither had any particular or notable contribution to Canaan that's recorded in Joshua or Judges, although Issachar was the tribe that was loyal to Deborah and Barak. Dan went off the rails pretty quickly. And I think I mentioned that Samson was an Ephraimite. Actually, I think he was a Danite. Samson would have been an example of somebody who kind of went off the rails as well. Well, Danite disappears from Israel's history pretty quickly in Judges. So, and then this kind of a pause, right? And it's a really nice pause. It's a pause in the middle of the blessings that are given for prayer and worship. It's almost like Jacob says, I need to stop, I need to take a break and make this statement. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. And I think Jacob is saying something personal here, that he's personally waiting for salvation from the Lord at this moment, but he's also making a plea for salvation for his family and all these prophecies that he's making. As Jacob continues blessing his sons, good stuff for Gad and Asher and Naphtali. Ultimately, the tribe of Gad joined Reuben in settling on the east bank of the Jordan. So part of Manasseh, the tribe of Reuben, and the tribe of Gad all decided to settle on the east side of the Jordan. All the other tribes would have been on the west side. So present-day Jordan would be where those tribes settled. And then Jacob reserves his longest blessing for Joseph, which is probably no surprise, and confirms his special standing amongst the brothers, which they probably all knew too well at this point, not only from his childhood, but from the special place that Joseph has within the family, and honestly, his position of prominence amongst the Egyptians as well. Within this blessing, I'm not going to read it, but if you look at the scripture, multiple references to God using a variety of his divine titles, an emphasis on blessing throughout. So Joseph is blessed over and over and over again. He describes Joseph as fruitful, which could be a subtle reference to Ephraim, whose name literally means twice fruitful. And despite his brother's hostility toward him, Joseph has survived, right? And not only survived, but he's thrived, right? He's thrived because he's sustained by the mighty one of Jacob. And then, anticipating the future, Jacob prays that Joseph's descendants will experience blessing upon blessing. In fact, blessings that exceed those shown to Abraham and Isaac, which is an amazing statement that Jacob would actually pray that Joseph and his descendants through Ephraim and Manasseh would receive more blessings than even Abraham and Isaac received. Jacob's final remark references Joseph as set apart from his brothers. And that could mean that Joseph and his descendants are going to be set apart for some of the holiest responsibilities, kind of like the Nazarites. It may simply be referring to his leading role among his brothers, that he's set apart from his brothers because of his leading role within the family, and ultimately the leading role that Ephraim will have throughout much of the history of Israel. It also may refer to the fact that he was set apart by the actions of his brothers, which they meant for evil, but God meant for good. And I actually kind of think that last one is really what Jacob's talking about here. It was a subtle slam on the rest of the brothers and something for them to remember that they had set Joseph apart from the rest of them with their own actions. I don't know, it could have been any of those three or maybe all of them. And then the last blessing is, for me, surprisingly brief, since Benjamin is also clearly a favored son, as we saw in the interactions of going to Egypt to buy grain the couple of times that they did. But the focus here seems mainly on the kind of tribe Benjamin will be versus Benjamin, the man. And obviously, there are notable Benjamites. And Benjamin is one of the tribes that remains loyal to the southern kingdom. So southern kingdom ends up being Judah and Levi and Benjamin, and eventually some of the Ephraimites and Simeonites come back from the northern kingdom and join. But nevertheless, southern kingdom includes Benjamin. And of course, the first king of Israel is going to be a Benjamite. King Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. Mordecai is also from the tribe of Benjamin, and Saul, or Paul, the apostle, is from the tribe of Benjamin as well. So notable Benjamites in a very special place in the kingdom of Israel. And so that ends the sort of formal blessing of each of the 12 men. And then it says, and these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And each blessing, Jacob says, each blessing that he had given is suitable to that individual. In other words, Jacob did this with intentionality, and he imparted a blessing that was suitable for that man and for that man's family. And so if it had some negatives, as Reuben's did, it was suitable for him. If it had some implications, like it did for Levi and Simeon, it was suitable. If there were good things, then it was suitable. And so Jacob is affirming that he knows what he's doing, right? And then he repeats the instructions that he'd already given to Joseph. Remember, he tells Joseph, you're going to take my body back to Canaan and bury it in Machpelah, in the cave where my ancestors are already buried. And Jacob had even sworn an oath to do this, right? So that sort of makes Jacob the executor of Jacob, or Joseph, the executor of Jacob's will, right? He has a sworn oath to carry out his instructions. And here, Jacob restates those same instructions to all the brothers that are there. Maybe, and Joseph doesn't really need the brothers' help to execute the instructions, right? He has all the means that he needs in order to get Jacob's body back to Canaan. But perhaps Jacob is sort of restating the instructions to get the brothers to help. In other words, maybe this is a way to bind them together in Jacob's death, to go do this as a family and not just rely on Joseph to take care of it. He's saying, this is what I want, and I want all y'all to take care of this, right? Joseph's clearly going to take the lead. He's the executor. But maybe this was meant to bring them together. Maybe Jacob wanted them to have a glimpse of the promised land again, right? He's going to carry them back, and they're going to see this is where we're supposed to be. And in fact, this is where we're supposed to be, even to the extent that our father wants his body to be back in the promised land, to remind them that they have a promise, an inheritance that they're going to have. So then at this point, Jacob joins the great cloud of witnesses. It says he's gathered his people. He dies. So he presents this blessing. He reminds them of the commitment that Joseph has already made and his expectations for them. And then he joins the cloud of witnesses. We bash Jacob a lot for good reason. He makes a lot of mistakes. He makes some good choices. He makes a lot of bad choices. He's not a great father. Maybe even to the end, he's not a great father. And I wonder if this cloud of witnesses is actually watching us instead of sleeping, because it could be either way. But if they're actually watching us, I wonder if Jacob flinches every time we talk about him. Or I wonder if he is actually glad that we're able to learn lessons from the choices that he made. I don't really know. But I do know that there are a lot of lessons that we can learn. One thing that we should learn is don't wait until a deathbed to say what needs to be said to those you love. Better yet, focus on sharing what needs to be shared with those you love while you're living. And I have a great example in my own life, a positive example of my own grandfather, my grandfather Craig. When he was close to the end for him, he actually sat down and he made cassette tapes that told stories of his life that he could give to us and we could listen to. And there's a set of, 5 or 6 of them where he just took the time to kind of do that. The interesting thing is, I don't need those cassette tapes. I already knew all of those stories. I don't need to listen to a cassette tape to hear his voice because I remember his voice. And in fact, what I remember about my grandfather Craig is the time he spent with me. The time he spent showing me how to put grease on a tractor, to take care of an implement, to learn how to plow a field, to just have fun going down to the cafe and having a cup of coffee and talking about life and all the different things that he said to me. I remember the life he shared with me, one of the things that he said to me. So my encouragement is for us to learn a lesson from Jacob and to share life while we're living rather than waiting until the end for things to be said or unsaid. Last chapter of Genesis, Joseph responds to his father's death like you'd expect him to respond with grief, right? He falls on his father's face and weeps over him and kisses him. And then he takes on his responsibilities. It says he's going to grieve. It doesn't talk about the other brothers. I'm sure they're grieving too, but this really focuses on Joseph as the executor of Jacob's will, so to speak. And so when his weeping was over, when his time of grief was over, he picks up his responsibilities. And this can't be very long. We're talking about a matter of a day or two, because he's going to command his servants, the physicians, to embalm Jacob in the way of the Egyptians, right? So Jacob's going to be embalmed. And this isn't a religious rite like it is for the Egyptians, because there's no Egyptian priests involved. This is just the physicians. It's a practical matter, because they're going to have to transport Jacob's body all the way back up to Canaan. The only way that's going to happen is if he's embalmed. So it's almost a providential thing that the Egyptians have this art that they're able to do this in such a way that the body can be transported without starting to decay. So this is a long process. It takes 40 days to properly embalm Jacob's body. And it says that the family and the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days, a 70-day period of grieving, which is the royal custom for the Egyptians. That was the amount of time to grieve a royal in Egypt. 30 days was pretty much the max for Hebrews. So they mourned for Jacob twice as long as you typically would for a Hebrew patriarch, and they actually mourned for him exactly like he was an Egyptian royal, which of course he was not. Joseph tactfully gains permission from Pharaoh to travel all the way back to Canaan and take Jacob's body. And then you see this in this passage, this amazing funeral procession that winds through the desert of the Sinai and all the way up through the wilderness back to this area of southern Promised Land, southern Israel, to this cave where they're going to bury Jacob. And what a sight it must have been as they traveled along. Past Bedouin tribes in their tents, past the cities and towns. Everybody would have taken notice, because not only was it a big group, but there were prominent Egyptians that were part of this procession that takes place. They even stopped at a threshing floor for 7 days and had a huge lament, such that everybody around noticed and ended up naming the place after the event that happens there. But ultimately, Joseph carries out his father's wishes, and Jacob is laid to rest in that cave. And because he's embalmed in the way the Egyptians, his body would have lasted a whole lot longer than all these other bones that had been put there. So he's going to actually be there intact for, quite a long time. Based on all the archaeological findings that have been found in Egypt, they were really good at preserving dead bodies. Look at verse 14. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So they're going back to Egypt, all of them. And then you see this, that Joseph's brothers start to freak out. And they're worried that now that their father is dead, now that Jacob's gone, Joseph's finally going to take his revenge. He's just been sort of acting these last 17 years. He's just been waiting, maybe reminiscent of Esau and Jacob. Remember, Esau said, as soon as dad is dead, I'm going to kill Jacob. Well, that seems to be their thought. They send messengers back to Joseph to deliver this message of, our father told us to ask you to promise not to kill us, even though we had done evil for you. And there's no indication whatsoever that Jacob gave that message to the brothers. Hey, remember, after I'm gone, make sure and ask your brother not to kill you for all the bad things that you've done. It doesn't sound like something Jacob would do either, that he would gather his sons close and give them that kind of advice. He's more of a kind of a dad that says, let things happen and see what it does. So I think they're lying with this message. And the reaction that they get is Joseph weeps over this. Most likely he's disappointed that there's still trust issues after 17 years and after all he's said and all that he's done and how he took care of his father, that they still don't trust him, that they still think that there might be revenge. It's also likely that he's weeping over the fact that he knows his father wouldn't have issued a command like this and that they're lying to him again. Either way, he's deeply disappointed. But because of his reaction, because the messengers most likely let the brothers know that Joseph responded the way he did with emotion, they show up to face Joseph and they fall before him down on their faces to the earth, fulfilling the dream that Joseph had told them all those years ago. Here they are doing exactly what Joseph had said his dream would indicate that they would do. And Joseph's response is to their request, right? It says, please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. We're your slaves. Do with us as you want. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. His response, am I in the place of God? Not only says, I'm not going to judge your behavior and what that means for the future. You've received your blessing from our Father. The rest is in the hands of God, which isn't exactly like letting them off the hook. He says, hey, don't worry about it. You're not responsible for your evil. He's just saying you're not responsible or accountable to me for your evil. You're responsible and accountable to God. Right? So that's still something that each brother has to wrestle with their own relationship with God and their accountability to him. And then he makes this amazing promise. I'm going to provide for you and your little ones, which he has the power to do as prime minister over Egypt. I'm going to take care of you. Finally, at the very end of Genesis, in the very last chapter, we see grace in human skin in the form of Joseph, who doesn't return evil for evil, but good for evil, and who offers grace to those who don't deserve it at all. What an amazing example Joseph is for us. The remaining 60 years of Joseph's life are undocumented, except for mention of grandchildren and possibly great-grandchildren, if that's what the third generation means in this reference. Joseph doesn't make his family swear to take him back to Machpelah, back to the cave. And I think it's because he knows that his burial grounds are not in that cave, but they're on the mountain that Jacob had bequeathed to him. And so his instructions are that his body is to be embalmed and that his body is going to be carried back to the promised land when the nation goes back to the promised land. He has a faith that he's demonstrating in these instructions that God's going to deliver on the promise that he made to his family. And his belief is so strong, and his faith is so strong that he's willing to trust his very dead body to that promise. He probably didn't imagine that it was going to take 430 years for that promise to start to be executed. But Moses fulfills that instruction that he gave to the people in Exodus 13, verse 19, where as they're leaving, they've got Moses or Joseph's body going along with the caravan. And Joseph's remains are eventually buried at Shechem, most likely on the slope of that mountain that was referenced. And so Genesis comes to an end. And it becomes the backstory to the primary audience that Moses is writing to when he writes Exodus and the law. And he says, before I can tell your story, I have to tell the story of your ancestors. And from that perspective, the whole Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, are our backstory. It tells us about the creation of man. It tells us about the first chapters of man and his relationship with man and his relationship with God, and how messed up all of those relationships were, and ultimately how God fulfills his promise to Abraham through Jacob's providential care and ultimately Moses' leadership of the people out of the land of Egypt and into the promised land. And all of this is not only the story of Israel, it's the story for us because it's our backstory as spiritual heirs to Abraham through our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So I hope you've enjoyed Genesis. Here's some truths from these chapters. The first one, at the end, more than anywhere else, actually, God will work his plan with us, through us, or despite us. God worked his plan despite all the things these brothers did, despite the mistakes Jacob made, through Joseph and his faith, and even the roller coaster ride that Joseph had. Ultimately, God works his plan. And even though it's going to take 430 years, he's going to work his plan and promise for the people through. We can learn from the successes and failures of those who precede us. We've been doing this whole series. We should not return hate. We should return hate with love. If we receive hate like Joseph did, we should return love to that hate. We should show grace to all, especially those who hurt us. That's the lesson Joseph teaches us here. It's not our place to pronounce spiritual judgment on others. That's God's place, right? And God will judge everyone, us, everyone. We should use the brains that God gave us to make good decisions and to test everything against the truth revealed in his word. And sometimes testing looks like judgment in that we decide to take a certain action or to respond to somebody in a certain way. But judging actions and behavior in situations is different than judging somebody's spiritual condition, right? We need to use the brains God gave us to make good decisions. Sometimes we see in Genesis good decisions and we see a lot of bad ones. I'm going to say this again. I've already said it twice. We should say and share what needs to be said and shared while we're living, not wait until we're gone for somebody else to say what should be said. We should live with a sense of legacy. What is our vision for the coming generations within the kingdom? And be proactive and intentional about that. The way that Joseph is intentional about that. The way he takes care of the generations and the way that he's thinking about what Jacob said about all these tribes and how they ought to be. And the way that Moses picks up that vision and executes. And Joshua picks up that vision and executes. And then finally, the message of Genesis. Kings come and go. Great men come and go. Bad men come and go. Kings come and go. But our King Jesus reigns. And we will be with him